Hello, this is Diane L. Richard talking to you about newspapers. The title is Extra Extra, Read All About It, Worldwide Tour of Newspaper Platforms and Resources. The associated handout includes the URLs for all of the mentioned websites. The focus is on free web-based access. There are many more platforms that are available for you to spend money on, but again, the focus here is on free. I put this Google logo here because if I mention something and for some reason I didn't put it in the handout or you have further questions, I just suggest Googling on whatever resource I identified, and then I think you'll find it a lot faster than trying to replicate a URL. So let's dive in. I have a lot to talk about and not too much time to do it in. So we're going to start with multi-country or worldwide platforms. And notice I said worldwide. So when I talk about Finnish newspapers a little bit later, we'll discuss translating newspapers that are not in your native language, because many of us are researching immigrant ancestors, and we may find that we will find that the newspapers are not in English, for example. So let's start with Google News. This is a much underutilized resource. Most people don't know about it. It was shut down in 2011 after 5 years, but the content is still available, and that's what people haven't realized. And here you can see that the newspapers are listed alphabetically. You can search for a particular newspaper. I don't usually search for the contents across newspapers. The search engine isn't that robust, but if you identify a newspaper that's relevant, then you can focus on that and look through it page by page. And the key to recognize is it does include non-English language newspapers, especially those from Quebec, Canada. And here's an example of a newspaper called The Dispatch, published in Davidson, North Carolina. And here you can see the typical layout for a newspaper. It's broken down by decades, and then whatever issues are within that. Normally within decades, it goes down to year, and then within year, it'll go down to months. And then you can identify the issues you want to look at. And then it is like just digitally flipping through a newspaper. And most of you are probably familiar with this now, since there are many digitized records on Family Search, and we're frequently doing this. And this is just showing you another newspaper, the Freeman. This was an African-American newspaper that was published in the late 1900s. So there's a lot of variety of newspapers that are published here that you might want to check out. Another cross-board platform is something called Veridian software. This is actually a platform used by many. So Veridian is not going to have the content of the newspapers, but what it can help you do is identify projects that have newspapers. And you can see here mentions of Purdue, Singapore National Library, Southeastern New York Library. There are hundreds of projects here. And here's an example of a project that I learned about through this, which was the Colorado Historic Newspapers Collection. I could then go to that website, and in this case, I can freely access that content. Now, sometimes what you're going to find is you may not be able to freely access a project mentioned on Veridian because it's behind a paywall as governed by their partner. But again, you can learn about the existence of the project and also identify often what newspapers might be involved. And Elefind is actually something that's powered by Veridian. I personally hadn't made this connection until a few days ago when I was pulling together this talk. And I had known about Elefind, I had not known about Veridian, and now those have collided. And Elefind is basically a search engine, as it says, across the world's historical newspaper archives. And what I have found is in Elefind, you find newspapers for Australia. There's also a few from Mexico, and these are coming via the Portal to Texas History, New Zealand, and various projects in the United States. And here's a list of some of the titles for Australia, which you can also access directly by visiting Trove. And here's an example just showing you directly accessing Trove, where you can then search on the newspapers. Europeana is a wonderful website. It is not limited to just newspapers, and that's something to keep in mind, that some of the resources I'm mentioning, it's not just what I'm talking about. There might be other things. So always use this as an opportunity to kind of go play with these websites. So Europeana does have a newspapers collection, and it does cut across Europe. And so if you're researching ancestors there, I would definitely check it out. And here we have Endangered Archives Program, which is actually a program coming out of the British Library. And you can see here where I have listed out a few newspaper related projects, such as the Barbadian, which is a historic Barbados newspaper. The goal of Endangered Archives isn't just newspapers, it's trying to preserve endangered archives around the world. And many of these do end up being in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So here we see a couple of examples of other projects found here. One is preserving Peruvian newspapers, the Arequipe Press, and then the other is the Barbados Mercury Gazette, which I was referring to, is the Barbadian newspaper. So newspapers are being digitized by a lot of different projects, so you want to check that out. Also, don't overlook something as basic as the Internet Archive. It actually has a newspapers collection. I personally use the website a lot more for looking at digitized books and things like that, but I found that there were digitized newspapers for Australia, Canada, China, Italy, and the U.S. And for the U.S., both English and non-English. So there could also be other resources to check out. Here's an example of a couple of newspapers. One is the California Eagle, which is the West's oldest African-American newspaper. It is digitized and online via Internet Archive. And then here we have a Ukrainian language newspaper founded in 1893, and it's the oldest Ukrainian language newspaper that's been published continuously. And it's actually published in the United States. National Library of Israel. This was a revelation for me, because what I learned through this, and you can see from what I've put up here, that there's newspapers that are published in a variety of different languages coming out of the regions, all the regions of the world, and various countries. And these are listed here, language, region, country. And you can select a region to focus. You can also select time periods. And that's the thing to recognize, is there's a lot of different options on these different newspaper websites, sometimes in terms of geography, sometimes in terms of time period, sometimes in terms of language, sometimes in terms of focus. So play around. I'm showing you little bits and pieces from each website, but not the capabilities across each one. So let's look at a few United States projects. One is Chronicling America, published by the Library of Congress. This is a large project covering all 50 states as well as the various territories. You have a newspaper directory. That's this little box up here on the right that you can select. This is going to tell you what was published, or as I put here, were published newspapers, so that you can pick a location, you can pick a time period. In this case, I identified African American newspapers. And then we get a listing of those. 36 results happened. So these just tell us that these newspapers have been documented to have surviving physical archives. Now, there's also a huge digitization component to this project, and you can look at a list organized by state that tells you what has been digitized and is available online through Chronicling America. And I find that very helpful because I don't want to be searching in a time period, not finding results to realize that those newspapers hadn't been digitized. So please do check that element out. And one of the newspapers that has been digitized is the Richmond Planet. And you can see here from 1883 to 1938, and then you can actually browse through these issues, or you can search on the issues. Again, a lot of capabilities I'm not talking about. I just want to kind of throw at you all these newspaper resources. The Ancestor Hunt is a very helpful website, and again, not just for newspapers, though there are newspapers and newspaper links on this website. And the key thing is this is a project of one person. Kenneth R. Marks. And remember that sometimes some of our best resources are just because somebody decides they want to put the effort in to create a gateway that will help us. And he operates both a Facebook page and then he has a blog, and these are great ways to get updates. So you can see here on the left hand side a Facebook update that was talking about ethnic and foreign language newspapers in the United States, and he has listed over 850 titles, and this is just some of the languages he identified. He also has a blog that he produces, which again gives you those updates and to check it out. So it's kind of nice to have the information come to you instead of you having to wonder what's new on the website. Old Fulton, New York postcards, it might be called that, but it's actually not just New York. And it's not postcards. We're looking at it for newspapers. It has an interesting search mechanism. It works. I'm used to it because I've been doing it for a long time. But other people might prefer to go to this third-party website, fultonsearch.org, that's been created, because the search features are probably a bit closer to what you've become used to. And I also want to emphasize for you that it also includes a list of included newspapers, and these literally are around the United States and beyond. So where it started out as New York resources, it has expanded and exploded beyond that, and actually has some newspapers from, I think, just about every state, and I think might even be creeping outside of the United States. So definitely check it out. So let's look at a couple of state-specific projects that are just good caliber ones. You have Digital North Carolina. I have to do that because I'm talking to you from North Carolina. I love that it has a map that you can use. This is something common you'll find on statewide platforms, that often there's a map to help you with the geography of what newspapers you would like to look at. And this website goes from very historic newspapers to very modern ones. And so that's kind of neat that it's literally the 1700s up to the 2000s. So it just depends by location. And here's what it looks like if you find an issue you want to look at. And this is, again, very typical of a lot of the websites. You'll have some kind of viewer, and then you'll have navigation controls that you can use. And again, they'll be a little bit different, but they pretty much all have a lot of the same features. And then you can go page to page. Often you can download something as a PDF, JPEG, etc. Digital Library of Georgia has been hugely growing its historic newspaper collections. It does a map in a broader sense of doing it kind of regionally, but then you can look at titles within a county. So if I picked East Georgia, I can see what titles are available, and you can do an across search, and you can do very narrow searches. Always remember to look for advanced search features because these will allow you sometimes to better pinpoint either time period, location, phrase that you want to research on, a person's name, etc. Virginia Chronicle, coming out of the Library of Virginia, again is another example of a state level newspaper project. And again, it uses a map feature to help us explore and to recognize that it does include some entries that are outside of the state of Virginia, and that's something to keep in mind. You can also search about on various categories. So that can be helpful if you want to look at African American newspapers, non-English, Civilian Conservation Corps newspapers, CCC, from back at the time period of the WPA and the CCC. That can be very helpful to give you that sense of what was occurring after the Depression and before the Second World War. Let's look at England real quick, the British Newspaper Archive. You can search for free, but it takes some money. You have to register or subscribe, as they say. And I checked it out a bit. Leslie Payne happens to be the name of my grandmother's second husband, and they lived in England, so I was just doing a bit of researching on him. And then some great news that came about just in August of 2021 is that are now free pages that you can access. So there's been a partnership that has occurred that is making free pages accessible, and I think ultimately it will end up being quite a benefit to those researching English records. And the other thing to recognize is British Newspaper Archive, you have to look at what were its territories at various times and or up to today. So you actually have the Royal Gazette of Jamaica pages are part of the British Newspaper Archive. So again, keep in mind some of those historical relationships. Again, some carry into today, some don't, but that will provide you access to newspapers you may not have considered before. Canada, early Alberta Canada newspapers. This is coming out of the University of Calgary. You can see a whole bunch of newspapers, which you can then further explore. Caribbean, we've already talked a bit about the Caribbean with the British Library's Endangered Archives, but you also have something called the Caribbean Newspaper Digital Collection. And in fact, it has literally just updated its website. So in December 2021, it now has a slightly different image, but again, you can pursue Caribbean newspapers. Finland. I always have to talk about Finland because I have Finnish ancestors. And there's a great historical newspaper library, and it really helped me in my research. Here you notice I say select in English. Whenever you're going to a non-English website, do check to see if there are language options and if English is one of them. If it is, choose English. But again, remember, it's only the navigation of the website will be in English. The newspapers are going to be in the language in which they were published. And so I did some researching for my family, which was Guiampa in Ilistaro, and I found this article. And what was neat about this article is I knew from church records of the death of this person. I did not know the circumstances of the death of this person. So this article, when translated, actually told me how he died, and that is priceless to my research. And recognize you can use Google Translate. I'm frequently using it. It's not perfect or whatever, but it's still helpful. So you can say, I'm going from English. In this case, I'm showing you English into Finnish. And then I reverse translate to go from Finnish back into English just to kind of see, does it make some sense? So that's definitely an option we want to have awareness of. Sometimes you're going to find online character generators. So here you can see how to type Finnish characters. I did not want to download a Finnish character set onto my computer. So this then allowed me to put in Finnish letters to get what I want. And then I copied and pasted it into Google Translate. And something to remember is, though I thought the newspaper was in Finnish, it was actually in Swedish. So this then allowed me to go from Swedish to English. And again, I learned about his death, which was his horse, cart, and himself went into the river and they drowned. And again, this is just another quick example about selecting Swedish. You can come back and watch again to see the recognition of switching. So make sure you know what language a newspaper is in. So again, many newspaper websites for non-English speaking countries have an English, or often it's indicated with a Union Jack or UK version, but not all do. France, here's a French one, and I'm buzzing along because I only have like 30 seconds to talk. So look for something out of the National Library of France. Look for something out of Poland. look for something out of Spain. So there are all these newspaper websites. Again, the details are all in your handout. And the single easiest place to start is a Wikipedia page, which is a list of online newspaper archives. And you can see it's broken down by country. So do check that out. And feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Here's my email. Here's my emails, websites, and the handout has my websites as well. So thank you so much, and sorry to have to buzz so quickly through this, and I hope you've learned about a few new newspaper resources.